understand and treat mental health disorders. On the side, I'm the chair of my department's Equality and Diversity Committee. So I guess that's my role here tonight.
Aoife, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Aoife McLysaght. I'm a professor in genetics in Trinity College Dublin, where I'm the head of department, and I'm also was the chair for our Athena Swan committee, which is an equality, diversity, includes. I always forget I forget that acronym. Anyway, EDI. I'm new to the acronyms. I'm not good with acronyms. But we just recently got an Athena Swan Bronze Award, so we're happy with that. And my work is in evolutionary genetics, where I'm looking at genome sequences of different organisms, especially animals, and comparing them, trying to figure out what are the patterns and processes of evolution and how that can inform our understanding of present day genetics. And so, and I do teaching and mentorship and all of those things that go along with an academic career.
And last but not least, Arlene.
Hi, everyone. I'm Arlene. I'm a third-year PhD student in School of Electrical and Electronics Engineering in UCD. And my research essentially focuses on developing data fusion models for biomedical signal processing for health inferences. And a bit about my background, I started my PhD 3 years ago, and before that I did my bachelor's in electronics and electrical engineering, and I worked for a year, and that's after that I started my PhD, and I am an active member of Women in Technology and STEM Ireland, so I guess that's why I'm here today.
Okay, so what drew each of you to a STEM education and career?
Will I just jump in?
Yeah.
It feels to me in retrospect that I didn't have an obvious path. I don't remember, obviously making a conscious decision at one point. I always enjoyed school, and I liked school, and science was one of the subjects I liked. I had a really, really great science teacher, and I think that's probably not an unusual story. People, if you have a really good teacher, it probably inspires you or encourages you to go in a certain direction because you enjoy it. But I didn't ever imagine that I would end up staying in science, partly because I had no idea of what that meant. And I had no idea what a job in science was. I had never met a scientist of any kind, like male or female. And, I had never, the furthest my imagination could stretch was, presumably there are people in hospitals who test the samples. That was as far as I could get to, like, what a job in science would be. So I didn't see myself doing a PhD. I know earlier, I remember in school, there were some very, very studious classmates. And I remember one of them mentioning that they wanted to do a PhD. And I was like, then you'll be 7 years in college. And like, here I am still in college, essentially. So obviously that worked out. But and so I chose to do science as a degree without a plan, just because I enjoyed it. And I think I was very lucky to not feel pressured to have a plan. And I think that was very lucky for me. And that was my parents, I suppose. I remember talking to my mum one time and saying, but I don't know what I'll do afterwards. And she just gave me the most wonderful piece of advice, because she said, do what you love and the job will follow, which is the nicest advice anybody could give you. And I actually think it's very true, because when you enjoy something, you are usually better at it, and you will put that bit of extra effort in that makes things work out for you. So I kind of drifted that way. So I didn't think I was going to do a PhD, and then I did one, and I didn't know what I was going to do after the PhD. But I suppose at that point I was really hooked on research, and I really enjoyed it. And I really, really enjoyed the university life. I suppose I just really love Trinity and genetics department there. And, so I think it became like my second home in a certain way, it still feels that way. So I was very lucky that I never had to leave.
Clara, do you want to continue?
Yeah, so we're all being really super polite. So I think my story is kind of, interesting in that, I grew up in a council estate in the north of Manchester, And so just going to university was an aspiration that not many people around me had. But my mother sort of fought, and I was able to get a scholarship to go to a private school. And so that was really great, and they really supported me, and it was a great place for me to thrive academically. And I learned that I liked science. But towards before my GCSEs, A levels, I started having a lot of trouble with my mental health. So I actually didn't finish my A levels. I dropped out of school because I just wasn't able to study. But then I had a few years where I was doing jobs that, you know, I was being told to do things by people that maybe I thought you could do this a different way, for instance. I don't know. I'm quite bossy myself, I suppose. And so I was thinking, well, what shall I do? I really enjoyed engineering. So I, like Arlene, I actually did an electrical engineering degree. And that was just because I had gadgets. I'm like, hey, I build my own computers. I can do this. And from that, I went on to work for a company in industry that made vacuum deposition equipment as an electrical engineer. I found out about the science behind material science, and I didn't even know what a PhD was at that time either, you know, but someone recommended me within the company and said, we think you'd be really good. And so next thing I know, I was doing a PhD at Manchester Metropolitan, and now I realize that I never want to stop doing science in academia. But I've had my wobbles. Of course I have. I've left a few times, but pretty much I know I love it.
Okay, thank you. Camilla, would you like to continue?
Sure. So a lot of my experiences in common. So I had some amazing teachers that encouraged me into science, but I certainly didn't know what I wanted to do when I was 18. And that was reflected by the fact that I chose one of these kind of triple undergraduate degree courses that's now been scrapped at Oxford. It was called Physiology, Psychology, and Philosophy. I think they've since decided like not a good combo, but anyway, I did it. And it was really, really fun. I loved it. And from the get-go, I knew it was the kind of neuroscience classes that I loved. But even then, it never really occurred to me that that was a sort of like possible career path. And it wasn't until I thought maybe I would like go to medical school and maybe become a neurologist. That was something I'd heard about. But then I met a scientist who would later become my PhD supervisor. And I think I was in his lab a couple weeks, and it just became apparent that the day-to-day business of being a scientist and the sorts of questions that I got to think about in my everyday life was more engaging than any kind of summer job or work experience I'd ever been able to do. And so that was really what captivated me, I think, was the questions that I could get to ask and maybe work towards answering as being a scientist.
Thank you. And then Arlene.
Yeah. So in my case, it was kind of an easy decision because in school, I always used to love math and I was good at it. And where I'm from, you make the decision on what field you want to go into by the time you're 15 so that you can learn the subjects that can help you in college when you're 16 and 17. That's the last 2 years of high school. So I was really good at math, and I was like, I should probably get into something like that, a math-based field. And also at the time, my dad was a mechanical engineer. Oh, he's still a mechanical engineer. And I found it amazing that he knew exactly how all the gadgets and equipment worked. And like some things just felt like magic. I think when I was maybe in 4th grade, that's when like the mobile phones became really common. And he knew exactly how it worked. It was like a new thing for me, but like he was like, oh, this is how it works. This is sending the frequency, and that's how it works. And I was like, that's so cool. Like, did you learn this in college? And my dad is like, no, the mobile phones were not there in college when I was in college. But then I was like, how do you know? And it's just like intuition, because, you know, I work with things like this, so I know. Because I feel like, you know, if being an engineer would help me be like my dad, like, you know, super cool that way, maybe that's the way I want to go. So that's how I got into electrical engineering.
So I think it's been touched on by all of you in your answers, but do you feel like you were supported in choosing like this field by your friends, your families, your partners, or your teachers?
So I would say, like, in case of family, absolutely, yes, they supported me. But when it comes to friends, I think they were as clueless as I was about like what they wanted to do in life. Um, but at that time, it was kind of like a thing where, people were all about, you have to do what you want to do. You can be anything or anyone that you want to be career-wise. And and when I'm talking about my teachers, I should also mention that I used to live in Saudi Arabia from the age of like 4 to 15 because my parents used to work there. And I went to an all-girls school. So like, because there were no co-ed education systems in Saudi Arabia. And I would not say that, like, because I was in a girls' only school, there was never really a comparison between boys and girls. And no one really discouraged girls from like, being good at math or like, saying, boys are better at it. So that kind of helped me in my formative years. Like it made me confident in like, because I was never compared, I was like, okay, I can do this. And that's how I got along. And my teachers were really supportive. Like they never said, oh, because you're a girl, you shouldn't go into math or science. And that's good in a way, because I have heard like friends who went to co-ed school say like they were always compared, like it was always the boys who went to the math competitions and it was all the girls who went into that competitions, that kind of thing. So yeah.
So maybe if we move on to Aoife.
So, well, I think I was luckier than Clara because I didn't have to fight to go to university, and I was, I think there was probably an expectation in my family that I would go, so that was very much supported. And then what I did when I was there was nobody had an opinion around me. Let's say, I was able to do whatever, but I was supported, and it was, I remember at one point during my school years, we had a guidance counselor, and he made this point to all of us in the class. Our school was in a nice area in Dublin, and so he could presume that we were all kind of comfortable, relatively comfortable families, for example. And he said, look, all of you here are privileged and you ought to know that. And he said, and it's sometimes you need to, you think everybody's the same, and when you're young like that and you're 14 and whatever. And he said, all of you have an advantage in your education because your parents are supporting you. Because I bet I don't need to come to your houses, and I bet all of you has a quiet place to do your homework. I bet your parents do things for you so that you can do your homework. So they go, like, we'll make the dinner and do the laundry, but you do your homework and you do your study, and you're given the time and the space. And it's very easy when you get used to that. It's very easy to forget that that's actually a very lucky circumstance and a very privileged position. And I had that, and I was very lucky. And so I was supported in doing what it was I wanted to do. And that is very, very lucky. And then when I wanted to stay on to do a PhD, I definitely got a lot, like, when are you going to get a real job questions. I did get those. and it's still possible, in pre-COVID days when I wouldn't be at home so much, I would still get a phone call from my mum every now and again, on a Wednesday afternoon going, are you in work? And I'm like, I have a job. I go to work every day. So anyway, but so I still get that a bit. But yeah, I was very lucky. I had a lot of encouragement. And then even when I got to university, the professors I met there were just really encouraging. And I think the part of the reason I really enjoyed university was I enjoyed the intellectual environment, because I enjoyed the fact that I could talk about these things that I was really interested in. You could find other people who were interested in them too. So you could have these kind of conversations about the science. And for me, it was genetics that really, set my neurons firing, because I got excited about it. And I could have these questions and have these conversations with professors who, of course, knew a million times more than me, but they didn't treat me like an idiot, So I could I could ask them questions and do these things. And that's something that I try very hard to make sure I continue, that we have a really nice environment in our department, so that the students can approach us and talk to us, and we can have this. And that was really precious as well. So I feel like I've been very lucky, but I suppose by definition I'm somebody who succeeded in this system, and I'm still in it. So I wasn't discouraged by lots of horrible experiences. I'm one of the survivors of the system.
Okay, and just moving on to Camilla.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think the only thing I can add to that really is that I felt under particular pressure just from my, I think, personality to achieve as much as possible when I was in school. And I went to actually, it was the opposite of what Arlene is describing, in terms of you were expected to do every single subject until you were finished. At my school and excel in everything. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to go to a top university. So the expectation was really not that you kind of select the things that you're best at, but that you sort of make yourself the best at everything. And whilst this was actually very unpleasant and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, I think I may not have chosen science if I hadn't been at a school that made us do that. Because I never had to work in English and languages. It just sort of came naturally to me. I could get top marks for anything, and I had to work really hard at science and at maths. And so, of course, my kind of self-perception was like I wasn't that great at them in comparison because it didn't come as naturally to me. And I suppose I sort of carried this with me even after I went and did a scientific degree, and even after I went and became a PhD student. And it wasn't until during my PhD that I realized, in fact, the things that that came quite naturally, that I didn't have to work as hard for, are actually real assets when you become a scientist, because I can write papers really quickly and I adore giving talks, and I have kind of theoretical and conceptual interests that maybe turn me in a slightly different direction than my peers, which can be an advantage. So it's funny how I think I wouldn't have had it if I hadn't been forced to do it. But in fact, those sorts of other interests or other skills ended up helping my scientific career, I think.
Thank you. That's such an amazing answer. So just then finally, Clara.
Yeah, I found that story from F really funny about mum saying, when are you going to get a real job? Because I had that all the way through my PhD postdocs, and my mum worked in a university, so she knew full well. But anyway, I think she just wants me to have a permanent contract, which as researchers is a little bit of a unicorn, I think. But yeah, no, going through school, I mean, my mum gave up a lot for me and my sister to make sure that we did have that good education and did support us and push us. And that was amazing. I think when I went to school, high school in the 90s, I had bipolar. And so teachers didn't have the same understanding of mental health awareness in those days. And we also had this law, which in the England, that meant you couldn't talk about being LGBT, which was Section 28. So, and that was only repealed in England in 2003. So, you know, we just didn't have those role models. So there was no one that really understood, but my school did what they could. What I would say is that my PhD supervisor in Manchester dealt with me during some of the worst years of my mental health. And, you know, I know full well that if I'd have had a different supervisor, I would not have finished my PhD. But he just believed in me. He knew I could do it, and he accepted the strange way I did things and supported me. And I am eternally grateful to my PhD supervisor, Peter Kelly, for just, because I was a nightmare. I was an absolute nightmare, and I know full well. I think he wouldn't recognize me now because, you know, hopefully I've chilled out an awful lot. But yeah.
Yeah, so vaguely related, today is the International Day of Visibility for LGBT plus people in STEM. And we know that both you, Clara, and Camilla are big advocates for the community. How do you think your experiences as a member of the community has affected your career in women in STEM? Or how do you think what is the environment like for a member of the community?
So first of all, I met my wife in the lab where I did my PhD, so I can't totally say anything negative about being gay in STEM. It's benefited me massively. However, I think that the experience of being LGBT in STEM radically depends which letter you are. So there's a famous statistic you sometimes see cited in kind of LGBT STEM events. And it's, actually, I've just forgotten what the number is, but it's like, say, LGBT students are 43% less likely to stay in STEM subjects if they choose it at the beginning of their degree by the end of their degree. And in fact, if you sort of dig into that statistic, it's driven by some of the letters and not by others. And in fact, in my letter, in the L, we are actually more likely to stay in STEM subjects than straight women, for who knows why, but a variety of reasons. But both of us, both straight women and gay women, are far less likely to stay in STEM than cis men or gay men. So whilst there's a disadvantage, say if you're a gay man being STEM, it's still an advantage comparable to being either category of woman. But in fact, my gayness is slightly advantageous, or at least more likely to keep me in STEM in this one study.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, so it had a big impact on me. I know. So I did a foundation year, I did an undergrad, I did visiting post and postdocs, and in all those years, I wasn't out as a trans person, and in 13, 14 years, I met 2 out gay people, no openly bi people, no trans people. Seriously. Because if you weren't in the community, you didn't see anyone. There wasn't that visibility. So I saw 2 gay people in 13 years. And so my assumption, and I was going to conferences around the world, so my assumption was I either transition or I'm a scientist. I didn't think I could do both. And there came to a point where for my mental health, I had to transition. I didn't have an option. So I'd actually signed up for a different degree because I thought I was going to have to start my career all over again. And when I came to Oxford, I only came to the interview just to prove how horrible it was going to be. And no one cared. No one cared about this weird goth person that turned up at the interview. They cared about what my skills were. I was so surprised when they offered me the job. They thought I was haggling for more pay because I just wasn't expecting them to give it me. And of course, I went back and I talked to all the people that I used to work with, and most of them didn't care either. But there were some. I had some horrible comments. I had people who stopped wanting to be able to work with me because I transitioned. But generally, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as what I expected. And of course, I started sort of talking about this, and other people were coming up and saying the same thing. I've had so many people who say, you're the first trans person I've seen do a talk. I was thinking of quitting science. And that's such a privileged position to be in. And admittedly, it means that over the last sort of 5 years, I've spent more of my time doing outreach and E&D. And now I've got to write grants again. And I'm like, oh no, I really should have been writing more papers. So there is that sort of balance of don't do it too much. But it's been such a privilege. It's been such an honor to experience science from that side. And, I get to work with the Royal Society last week, released a toolkit for working with LGBT plus scientists. And it was just amazing to be a part of that process. And the ego's good because there's a little picture of me in there, but it's been a real privilege. And so it's really given me a very different view of science, I think.
Would you say that a lot more work has to be done to make science and academia a more welcoming place for LGBT plus identifying people?
Well, I mean, Clara, I'm totally gutted that you didn't know anyone out in science for so long. I think there are subject by subject differences. I think the physical sciences, even in, even the departments I know here, it is more difficult. But it's such a drastically different experience than the one I had. But as you say, that may have been because I was out. I've been out since I was at undergrad, so it was sort of 2009. And I've been out in every lab I've ever worked in or rotated in or been an intern in, anything. And it has, I suppose then everyone comes out of the woodwork. So in my department at the moment, I would say it's over 10% out and queer. So that's pretty remarkable. And I think it's helped by the fact that there are a number of us who are moderately senior in the department and who are openly gay or queer. And I think that's probably why even much more junior people, research assistants or students, feel that they can be out.
I think what you just said about more people being willing to talk if you're out and open, that's the experience I've seen. I mean, I was shocked that I wasn't the only queer in the village. And I'm pretty sure, I wasn't. But I think even my undergrad was electrical and electronic engineering. and there was one person who was identifiable as a woman, no teachers. The bathrooms were on every third floor for the women, whereas they were on every floor for the men. And so there wasn't even that gender equality in terms of the binary genders, at least. There wasn't that equality there. Like I say, there was one woman on my course, and I worked in industry for a year, came back, and there was 2 women on the course. Or like I say, there might have been more because some of us were hiding. But so even from that point of view, and certainly when I was working in industry, hiding as a white straight male, I saw the racism, I saw the sexism, I saw the homophobia, and that did not make me want to come out any quicker. I mean, that just drove me further and further in the closet. I heard a lot of things that I shouldn't have heard. So I think that's why it's so important. We do still have a long way to go. It's great to see learning societies get on board. It's great to see universities celebrate LGBT STEM Day. And also, we are seeing these role models, especially with Twitter and things. There are a lot more visible LGBT role models, and also like LGBT and disabled, or LGBT and Black. We're starting to see even more intersections, and that's really exciting, because there are, like I say, plenty of us, and we're starting to gain that visibility.
Thank you. Arlene, as our youngest panelist, do you think that like a lot of work has been done to increase inclusivity in recent years for progression into postgraduate study? I think you're still on mute.
I would like to think that there's been like significant work done to encourage women to go into postgraduate studies. Like as a person, when I started my undergrad itself, I knew I would be studying further after my undergrad, and that mainly came from like my dad basically being like, oh, you can't stop with just a bachelor's. And when I was working, he used to be like, okay, when are you going to start your master's? That kind of thing. And I think it's a recent phenomenon because I think 2 weeks ago, I was talking to an older acquaintance of mine, and she was telling me about her postgraduate experience 30 years ago in Ireland. And she said she wanted to credit a math module, which was level 5 or level 4. And the professor wouldn't let her credit the module solely because she was a woman. And she had to convince him that she was good at it. And so that's like 30 years ago. And I know that right now, we are not going to face that issue because, people know it's not okay to be sexist, like to your face at least. And there are like institutional checks in place to ensure that these things don't happen. And at the same time, there are like universities have tried to look into, increasing diversity and gender equality these days, and which I think is a great move it's the right move in the right direction, as well as many organizations are trying to like get more women on board, get more people of color on board to like increase diversity in the workplace. So I definitely think compared to what it was 30 years ago, it's gotten better, but it's nowhere close to what it should be if it was an ideal world where everyone was equal.
I'm still just not over not being credited for a level 4 or 5 class. I would be very, very upset if that happened. How have you felt how have you felt your experiences have been being a woman of colour in STEM in Ireland? Is it better than you expected? How do you feel?
So I would like to think my experience is not really different from any other women. Yeah, definitely. Like I didn't have any expectations. I never expected to be treated differently in the first place. Maybe for being a woman, probably because I have had that experience when I was doing my undergrad, but not for being a woman of color. But maybe it's also because I'm not recognizing it, because I have not been trained to recognize it, because I used to live in a place where people look like me. And so maybe I'm not recognizing it, but I do not think I have faced any issues being a woman of color here in Ireland. And I'm very, very grateful to work in a group that is very accepting of who I am. And I think it's a privilege to be here and not have any problems with it. But also like a completely unrelated issue is that women of color, like most of the time there are a lot of international students who are people of color, and for them it's like two different communities altogether. Like they have a community back home which has certain set of expectations placed on them, and a community here which is the Irish community. And because of that, like they have to embrace two parts of their life. So like as an Indian woman, like the expectation placed on me was, I'll have a job by the time I'm 24, like finish all my studies, like never really planned on doing a PhD, get married by 26, and like have kids and like have a house by 28. Like, so I'm breaking like a lot of expectations. I'm like destroying everybody's expectations by like doing my PhD, and like probably gonna be doing this for a long time. So that's one thing that's different. Like culturally, there is like a lot of struggle that women of color have to go through, but that is not because of anything that is wrong here or anything. It's just how they see themselves and what they want to do with their lives. So that's all.
Do you think there's anything we can do to make it easier for you, or for to just kind of bridge that gap? That like anything like we here can do to help?
So one thing is like when I was growing up, I never really had like a role model in STEM, like a women role model or a woman of color in STEM that I looked up to. So especially for women of color, like I know that I read a study by CompTIA. It said like it was a study between Black girl students and white girl students in school levels, and it said like there was 45% of Black girl students said that they are interested in STEM fields and want to pursue a career in STEM, while 22% of white female students said that they're interested in STEM. So it's like not in schools that this gap starts. It's like once they start their university education, and it is said that around 60% of colored women face discouragement from their professors when they were pursuing a career in STEM or studies in STEM. So the discrimination starts, like, I would say, like, discouragement essentially starts when they are in university and when they're trying to apply for jobs. Like a white woman of similar qualifications are often preferred over the Black woman or a woman of color. And at the same time, once they are in the profession, because of the kind of support system that they do not have, women of color are passed over for promotions and stuff. And because of this, they are discouraged and they eventually quit the profession, which leads to like not many women of color rising to the ranks of leaders and being essentially role models for younger women to, follow their footsteps. So this is like a vicious cycle. The less women we have in STEM, less women of color we have in STEM, it doesn't encourage more women of color to get into STEM. So the only thing that we can do is educate women of color about role models that they can find, even though they're not right there in the public eye, and educate everyone to be supportive.
I think, Arlene, you're going to be an amazing role model for so many people in the future. But moving on, in non-STEM courses, dropout rates are almost on par between male and female students. However, in STEM fields, female students display a 23% higher dropout rate than their male counterparts. From your experiences, why do you think this is an issue? Or not really, why is it an issue? Why do you think it's so?
Yeah. I could start if you like. So, I mean, I don't have the full answer to this. I have some opinions and ideas. I think within science, there is sometimes this atmosphere and this myth that goes around of what it takes to succeed in science. And that myth describes a very unfriendly, somewhat hostile environment where you must give up everything else in your life in order to be a good scientist. That there's no way you can't succeed unless you're willing to work till 10 p.m. every day, 7 days a week, and you shouldn't have outside interests and friends essentially. And that's a myth. It's not true. But there are plenty of people who are who promote that myth. Some of those people, probably because it helps them overwork their PhD students, if I'm being a bit cynical, they're like, it's the only way of getting ahead, you better work like this. And so I was very lucky that I had so I didn't have female role models. But I had really great scientific role models who worked in a normal way and were still the top of their game, basically the top of the field. So my PhD supervisor when I was in Trinity is Ken Wolfe, who's now in UCD. And I met him when I was an undergrad, so I didn't know how famous and brilliant he was because he was just one of my lecturers. And he's never going to be the one who tells you how famous and brilliant he is. So he never told me. It was only after I was already his PhD student. I liked him, we got along well, and I liked the work. And I went to a conference and I had that conversation that everybody has, where are you from and who's your supervisor? And when I say I was working with Ken Wolfe, people go, wow, how'd you get into his lab? And I was like, I was in the pub one day after a seminar, and it was like not some really difficult selection process. Anyway, so I saw him as someone who so his wife's also a professional scientist, and Ken was the one who did the school drop off and pick up. So his hours were dictated by these pick up and drop off times. And he was still the most brilliant scientist. And I saw a few other examples like that. And that's what I needed, because I also saw other examples and people who tried to tell me, people who weren't even my supervisor, who was none of their business, trying to say, oh, it's not good enough if you're not doing such and such. And I had a conversation actually with Ken during my PhD when I'd had one of these unpleasant conversations. And I talked to Ken about it, and he was saying, no. And that was, I don't think, he said it a lot more than that, and I won't, a lot more eloquently than that, but he possibly doesn't even know what an important conversation that was. I remember it very, very clearly. And, he was saying, there's a big difference between working late because you're on a roll and working late because somebody's looking over your shoulder. And, and good science is as much about pottering around the library, virtual library these days, thinking about ideas as it is about working on something at the bench or whatever. And that's what I needed to hear. And so that was really important. But I think that potentially unfriendly atmosphere, that idea that you must make all of these sacrifices, that's just not an acceptable sacrifice for lots of people. And I think maybe a bit more for women, that's not an acceptable sacrifice. So I think that's one thing. I think that myth puts off men as well. Because I think it's a very off-putting, story. But I think women, for perhaps if they're potentially thinking about children is one thing, or they might even be imagining there's a future where I'd like children and this just doesn't look compatible. There's a future where I'd like a family and this doesn't look compatible. I think that's one possible idea. It's not the whole story, but I think that idea of that atmosphere, which I'm very happy to say is not a true story, is off-putting.
Thank you. So moving on to Camilla.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose that I agree with that entirely about sort of volitional dropout. But then I also think there's an influence of factors outside of that particular woman's control. And part of that, at least part of that I've observed, comes in the form of colleagues attributing women's successes to other people, often their male mentors, or perhaps just kind of like belittling what they've discovered in the first place. So it's so funny that I didn't see it until one day I saw it. I just sort of I was maybe midway through my PhD, and I just sort of knew that the smaller number of female PIs that were very well known where I was doing my PhD, some were known to be really unpleasant to work with, bitches, and some were known to not really be that great, not as great as their male colleagues. And this doesn't describe everyone, but it describes the people who were talked about. And I didn't really know any of these. I also only had male mentors, so I didn't know any of these small number of women professors personally. I just sort of knew their names, and I was like, yeah, like I guess that's just how it is. And then I was like, it's funny how they all have something in common, though, right? And after that, I heard it all the time. Once you see it, you see it. So all of a sudden, every time someone would be saying, oh, so-and-so's lab in Zurich, like absolute hellhole, wouldn't go there. This is what she does. This is what she does. This is what she does. I would think, maybe it's tough, but I bet there are equally tough labs run by guys who aren't being slagged off like that. And yeah, that's so I haven't actually experienced direct sexism, but I imagine people, denigrate my success all the time. Like, it's like, that's fine. I think that's what I would expect based on what I heard. If anything, what I would hope, because it was only the really successful female scientists that they did this to.
So then, Arlene, have you come across anything?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that come into play here. Like, I would think the biggest probably is like the lack of support from or encouragement from society or teachers, because in universities, especially, like I said, I have faced like not in your face sexism, but kind of like some kind of sexism. And the only reason why I'm here today is because, at least in my formative years, and support from my family and friends telling me that I'm good at it, but like not all women have access to it. And that could cause, like, especially in your first year, after your first year, like women tend to drop out a lot more, because like once you start sticking to it, like you will try to see through the finish. But if you feel like, you are not valued or underrepresented, especially, like, you would not want to continue there. And the other thing is what is something called social belongingness. Like in STEM fields, it's mainly men dominated. Like in my class of like 70 students, like there were 16 girls and the rest were boys. So it's like you try to be in the group that you're most comfortable with, and you try to go into the field that, there are more women in. That could also be a reason why, women tend to drop out, because they're not in a comfortable environment. They feel underrepresented. That could also be a reason why girls drop out of STEM education.
Thank you. And last but not least, Clara.
Yeah, I'm trying to read what I wrote on my hand as notes, but I think it's important that one of the funding bodies, the EPSRC, they released a report earlier this year, and it showed that women are less likely to apply for the larger grants, research grants, as a PI, as a principal investigator. But not only that, they're also less likely to get them than their male counterparts as well. So we're actually seeing data that shows that whatever the reason, there seems to be some sort of bias. And sadly, there is going to be a similar report coming out when it comes to race as well. I've seen very similar statistics. So, there's definitely something going on here. And the truth of the matter is that there's a big push for improved equity in STEM. But there's also a lot of academics who are very, very willing to speak out against equity in STEM. And they know that if we have, if people have an equal chance to get funding, we can't pretend that their chances suddenly drop. It's not like they're not losing out by promoting equity. If we're getting a higher chance of getting funding, then their odds are going down. And we've got to be honest about that. And it's really sad to see that there are, prominent academics who have talked about, when we're talking about institutional racism, they've called it tribalism, and we should keep that out of STEM in national press. How there are physicists who say that women just can't do physics. They're just not as good at it as men. And, they're perfectly willing to do this. And guess what? They're not getting in trouble. They're allowed. They're still academics. They're still in that position. And we have to start holding people accountable for that. There is some truth in the matter that men have made most of, the historic big scientific breakthroughs, but that's because women weren't allowed to do science. If you're not in the lab, how are you going to make these decisions? It's not a genetic thing. It's just, you can't do it. And so we can't change history, but we can certainly sort of tip the balance now. And so our institutions really need to take a stand and start saying that, this anti-equality work, it's just not on, because it will push more people out.
Can I jump in there? Because did you see, I don't know how many of you saw, there was an article, I just saw it was Nature Communications. I saw it today. I don't know if it came out today, and it was horrible. It was essentially, if you're female and or you have a female mentor, things are just basically going to go worse for you. So what we should do is stop bothering with female mentors, was the conclusion, rather than we have bias problems. It's just like, well, ladies, because they're going to say ladies, aren't they? Well, ladies, you gave it a nice try, but just don't bother. It was basically, so it was horrible. Anyway, so
I was so disappointed by that article. I mean, mostly it sort of made me go, oh my God, it's true that in my case, my two biggest mentors have been men, and probably that has advantaged me. At least that's what this article would imply. And that's profoundly depressing. And it's also depressing to think that as a woman, because it also went, the relationship went in the other direction. Mentors often benefit from being a mentor, but you don't as a woman if your mentee is also a woman. And that's horrible. So basically it's depressing on all fronts. And yes, the conclusion they came to was to start discouraging female mentorship, which it's like, I mean, that's one interpretation.
It's a symptom of the bias that's there, and so they're just kind of going, oh no, see, the bias is working or something, is what they're thinking. I don't know. What Clara said reminded me actually of, there was so the IRC, the Irish Research Council, that has PhD and postdoc applications, so these early career people, early career fellowships, they started gender blinding their applications a few years ago, and the female success rate went right up. So that was also very interesting, that when you didn't know this person was female anymore, suddenly their science was better. Go figure. I
think I just shouldn't be a woman, to be honest, after this. So a question for Aoife. You've done a lot of outreach work with children and young adults, such as at Christmas lectures with the Royal Institution and at Electric Picnic. We would love to hear from you about how to make science accessible and understandable to the general public and younger generations.
Well, okay, there's one reason I do it, and it's not anything noble, it's because it's fun, and that's why I do it. I love it. I'm a bit like Camilla in that I like talking to people and I enjoy that, and so I've got one of those weird skills for a scientist that I enjoy that whole thing. And like the Christmas lectures was the most fun I probably ever had. It was so brilliant. And so, I don't have these lofty ideas of spreading the word and all of that kind of thing. I think that's a nice side effect. And actually, I very specifically don't try to persuade anybody, because I don't think that's right. I don't want to persuade people to do. I want to show them an open door and let them see what's there and let them decide to go through it by themselves. And I think, that's the way I view it. I'm like, look, there's stuff over here in case you're not aware of it. And wouldn't you like to see that? And if you like it, come on through. And so what I do, in terms of how I approach it, I always just kind of, I actually find that I'm not exactly sure what other people are going to like, so I do what I think I would like. So that's my approach, and it mostly works. I think it's hard to, when you're talking to people, it's hard to try and imagine a general everybody, because they kind of become a nobody, like they become somebody that doesn't exist. So if you imagine what might work for somebody, so sometimes I think about what would I like, other times I think about maybe a specific person, how would I explain this to them and get them excited about it? And that seems to kind of work a bit better. But I think the fact that I enjoy it really helps. So I like telling, I like talking, and I was the annoying person who would explain things to people when they didn't ask for an explanation. So I'm kind of that person who likes explaining things. So maybe I'm a mansplainer, but I do remember distinctly when I was an undergrad in labs. So one thing that I always liked stuff. I always liked college, and I always liked everything I was doing. So I was always listening attentively and like eagerly going ahead and doing the things. And I remember one time actually was in a chemistry lab, and I saw the people next to me were missing out on a step that was important. I was like, oh, you need to do this first. And they're like, Aoife, we didn't ask you. But so maybe I kind of have that in me, and I just found a way of channeling it in a less annoying way.
Why do you think it's so important to teach young people about science at a young age, and what do you think that we can do as a society to make STEM more inclusive?
Well, I suppose for me, I mean, if I think back to myself, I had no idea about anything to do with science at all when I was young. I only learned it when when I was in secondary school. I started learning about it in my science lectures, or my science classes, and I just was lapping it up. And I suppose I think I would have liked to have known about this stuff. And that's the way I think about it. I think it's nice. I think also, in a more fundamental way, that science is one of the amazing accomplishments of human beings, and the same way that we think it's important to recognize the literary and the musical accomplishments. I think it's something that people should be aware of more. And I think they are much more aware now. Kids today know stuff like first time I go into a school and I'm like, what do you think DNA is? And they're like, well, they're telling me about genes and DNA. And I didn't even know. The first time I ever heard anybody say the word genome, they happened to be not a native English speaker. I thought they were mispronouncing gnome. This is me, and I'm now a geneticist, right? And I was not 5 when this happened, okay? I was probably 16, and I thought they were mispronouncing gnome, and that's how little I knew compared to kids today. But I think it should be recognized as a part of human culture, and even whether it's something you're going to be a professional at or not, I think it's nice to appreciate. So like I'm not capable of being a professional musician, but I enjoy music. And I'm not capable of writing a novel, but I really enjoy literature. And I think science should have that. People sometimes think, oh, there's no point in doing it unless you're going to be one. It's like, no, it's part of human culture as well. And I think that's why it should be there for young people too, because it's a really amazing part of being human, the stuff that we can do and the stuff that we can understand. And like we have examples like very, very current, because there's this enormous pandemic that means we're all sitting at home with our laptops instead of sitting together somewhere. But we understand it very quickly. We recognize what it was very quickly, not quickly enough for some people. And then now we're talking about 2 different vaccines announced within a week of each other that have huge potential. And this is amazing and this is extraordinary. And even in the lockdown, we're able to continue with things because of all the gadgets and the tools we have. And so all of this stuff is amazing. And it's nice to every now and again go that this is actually something to be appreciated and to be admired.
Thank you. So a question kind of for everyone. Women in STEM often face imposter syndrome or inferiority complex. Have any of you felt that way, or do you feel like you were made feel that way?
I'll say something on that only because I recently heard the most amazing talk on imposter syndrome by this neuroscientist in Oxford called Michelle Veldsman, and it was just so profound. And in the talk, she was discussing sort of different types of imposter syndrome, and she had sort of experienced, I suppose, perhaps the type that many people experience, which is where you feel like you're not quite clever enough and you're not quite a scientist enough to be taken seriously. But she felt that she'd also experienced this kind of additional type of imposter syndrome by being Black at Oxford, which almost no one is, and being relatively senior. She sort of gets asked to be on various panels, or perhaps her photos taken. I'm not sure what sorts of examples she had, but she was always sort of quite aware that perhaps she was being tokenized. And that was another layer of imposter syndrome, because even if she completely rightfully deserved these accomplishments, I mean, she's very successful, she would always have that doubt in her mind, like, well, maybe it's because I'm literally the only Black scientist in my department. So this talk was great, and I was like listening to it and like really enjoying it. And I thought to myself, well, I don't really experience imposter syndrome. I suppose it's a little complicated because in my field, it's very multidisciplinary and lots of people have a mathematical background, engineering background. So I'm a genuine imposter. It's not. And then I was like,
It's like, I'm not paranoid. They are all out to get me. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't have imposter syndrome. I'm an imposter. I have imposter syndrome all the time as well. But I think I lots of men do too, right? I think there's because I know when I say it to some of my male friends, they're like, yeah, I have imposter syndrome all the time, and it's a bit of wondering, like that. Oh, did I just get lucky in certain ways? Was I certain things that, because I suppose that it's because we all know examples of people who we think are brilliant, and for whatever reason it hasn't exactly happened for, and you're like, why would I why would it work for me and not for somebody else? And so there is maybe that comes into it sometimes, but yeah, imposter syndrome is, it's real, it's there, I feel it.
Yeah, I feel it all the time. Like, I honestly believe that everybody's gonna call me out for the fraud that I am and like question my work. And for me, being here is absolutely terrifying because like I get really, really nervous when I have to like talk in front of a group of people. So I feel like, especially like it gets worse when like, when you submit articles to conferences and journals and it gets rejected, and then I go like, oh my God, my science is not good. I'm not doing good work. But I don't think it has anything to do with me being a woman. I think it just stems from the fact that I feel like I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing really well.
I think, I mean, that imposter syndrome, definitely, I feel it too. And of course we do. But one thing that I do say is that, I kind of feel like my career's sort of done, and that, I've achieved what I'm going to achieve. And so for me, it isn't about sort of what I can do for me. It's what I can do for the next generation, what I can do for people coming through schools or the undergrads. And so as much as I feel really, really uncomfortable in a lot of places, it's like, no, we need to be present in the room so that we change this for the next generation. And especially, we were talking about outreach before, and I love it when I go in a school as a Stonewall school role model, and they see this sort of semi-adult who's covered in tattoos and maybe has bright blue hair, and then I'm like, oh yeah, I'm a scientist at Oxford, and the kids' faces just go, and that's great though. It just trying to break down those perceptions. So yeah, I definitely feel it, but like I say, I don't care whether I'm being no one wants to be tokenized, but at the same time, if we can change it for the future, then then I try and power through that, But there are times when I've been somewhere and I've just been sat in a corner and started giggling because I'm like, I shouldn't be here. Why am I here?
Well, that's kind of how I feel right now. What advice would all of you give young women starting their journey in STEM today? It's a pretty heavy question, I'm aware.
It's not an easy one, right? Because the best advice is tailored to the person receiving it. But I think in general, I'd like to pass on the same advice as my mum gave me, actually. Do what you love, and the rest will follow. And I think it worked for me, and I think it works for a lot of people, because even if you're deciding what subject to study, or if you're trying to do, like, if you decide you want to do a PhD and what project to do and things like that, I always think of it like a matchmaking exercise. It's not that a given person might not be capable or good at doing a PhD, but they might not be good in the wrong lab, and they need to be in the place that works for them. So I think follow your interests, follow what you love, and enjoy it all. And the other thing, I suppose, now, as I said, I had nothing, and now I keep thinking of things. There was a time in my life when I was impatient for my life to start. I thought, this isn't my life because I'm still in my education, and my life will begin. I'll be a real person. I'll be living in the proper way once my education is over. And getting over that was the best thing I ever did. I was like, no, it's now. This is it. And actually, it's cool, and I'm enjoying it.
Thank you. Clara, do you want to add anything?
It's interesting. There was back when, in those times when we could have meetings and see other people, we did a girls in physics outreach event, and there was 100 girls there from lower down in high school, and it was amazing that during the panel they were saying, like, am I gonna be on the receiving end of misogynistic behavior? And these were 10, 11, 12-year-old girls, and they were very aware of the situation. And I think it's always important to be honest and go, look, things aren't perfect yet, but we're working on it, we're trying, and this is what we're doing. So I think, we've got to be honest, but at the same time, I do think that everyone can get to those positions. And one thing that I definitely like to press is that with the internet, with all the negatives, we've got such a wide network of support around us potentially. You know, there are different people that you can reach out to. You might not, you know, there might not be another transgender material scientist in Oxford, but maybe there'll be a trans scientist in the UK somewhere, or maybe around the world. And this globalism means that we can have that support. And it also means that you can sort of check in and be like, hey, is this professor okay to work with? I did that about a potential job recently. Like, is this person okay to work with? Do I want to work with them? And that's a real, we shouldn't have to do that, but it is a real power in being connected to other people and being able to find out, no, this is not okay. What you're experiencing, that's not okay. And it's nice to have people to talk to about that.
Thank you. Arlene, do you have anything you'd like to add?
So I just have like some practical tips that you can, you know, give young kids, like girls getting into STEM. Like, so there is like no real statistical, like I haven't found like a good study that says men are better at it than women are. So there is no study like that. So you're going to be good at it. You're as good as anybody else. So don't quit. And also the other thing is that it may seem easier to be in a field where, you know, you are with more women and stuff, but like you have to stick to STEM if you're really interested in it. Like it's always important to prioritize your interest versus comfort. And another thing is like you should surround people who are going to support you, because there are going to be like quite a good bit of people who might discourage you. So you need that group of people who are going to support you, because you're all human and it's difficult. So you need people who are going to support you. So surround yourself, find your network. And speaking of network, have a network of women, like senior women, like, or experienced women, because they can give you tips, they can give you advice, they can act as informal or formal mentors for your life, in your life and in your career. But now, you know, the article in Nature Communications is saying like, no, it's not good. But I think it's a very valid advice. You know, you have to have women mentors in your life. And yeah, and the other thing is like this network is really important, because for any growth to happen, like in any field, you have to be at the right place at the right time. And having that network essentially ensures that you get the opportunity to be in the right place at the right time. And also support other women in STEM, because the place you are here today, the reason why you're here today is because there were so many women before you who fought your battles for you. So you have the responsibility to fight your battles for other women coming after you. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. And Camilla, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Okay, so I was going to say no, because already after Aoife spoke, I was like, well, that's it. I've got nothing to add. That's it. And then I was like, oh God, like Clara had more to add and it was great. And then I was like, oh no, Arlene had more to add and it was also great. So thankfully I have thought of one thing, and only one. Do something else as well. Don't make your whole life about science. Have a hobby, have something about you and your identity that isn't just science, because you will not always be lucky. Even if you're lucky enough to stay in science as I've been, there are so many moments where you will feel like a failure as a scientist, and having something else that makes you you about your identity is essential.
Thank you. We've had a couple of submitted questions that came in as we were talking. So to start, Arlene, I have a question for you. You mentioned you grew up in Saudi Arabia. That is so interesting. Did the strict gender norms from the wider society impact you in any way? You're muted. Arlene, you're muted. It happens to everyone.
Yeah. So like, even though I lived in Saudi Arabia for like a really long time, I was kind of like in a bubble. Like, sure, there were like a few things that I found was like really unfair, like women couldn't drive and you couldn't be outside without a male escort. And also like, I never really got to hang out with my friends after school, which is kind of sad. But like I was there for like a really long time from like when I was a child. So it never really affected me. Like I didn't think like a life outside that is possible. So I don't know. But there were some things that I like for example, you have to cover yourself from like head to toe when you're going outside. So I could just wear my pajamas and put that on top of it and like go out and I would be fine. That was great. Like I didn't have to dress up. But again, because I lived in Saudi Arabia, that was I went to a girls' only school, and I totally like how that was important in my formative years. So I think that was a good part of living in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, I don't think it affected me negatively, but I do think if I had lived somewhere else, I would have developed a bit more as a person and be more exposed to things outside my immediate bubble, like and grown as an individual as a whole. But that's what life gave me, and I'm happy with it.
Thank you. And now we have a question for everyone. And it is, what do you hope is the future for women in STEM?
Whatever they want it to be. And that's the main thing, that people can do what they want, and you know, that as many women who want to do it have as good a chance as anybody else. So
Yeah, I want to see these artificial barriers just removed. Like you say, this idea that, you know, oh, you're going to have children, therefore you can't be in the lab, that you've got to work 60 hours a week and 20 hours at weekend, just all these artificial barriers that people are putting in. And I'm pretty sure that sometimes they're being put up just to keep certain people in science and certain people out. So we just need to be breaking down those stereotypes a little bit as much as possible.
Moving on, we have another question for everyone. What advice would you give to your undergrad self? Did you take a break between undergrad and PhD?
Right, so I did, on account of not really knowing what a neuroscientist was. So when I finished my undergraduate degree, I thought, okay, I'm going to like study really hard, take out loans, and do graduate medicine. And so that year I moved from Oxford to London with a bunch of my kind of undergraduate friends, and in that year I learned what it was like working in a lab, which really I was just doing for sort of work experience. And in that year, I learned that I wanted to apply for PhDs. And in that year, I learned that I wanted to become a neuroscientist. And I didn't know any of that until I was there. But I don't know, maybe I would probably just tell my undergraduate self to learn to code.
Any other words of wisdom?
I will say that I mean, I put a lot of pressure on myself because I hadn't finished school. I had a lot of pressure on my first degree to try and get the best grades to prove that I was capable of getting those. And to be honest, I'm not really sure. I'd love to be able to tell myself to chill out, but I don't know. That's not who I am. So that would never happen. But one thing that one thing that I think I did do well, I did a degree in electrical engineering, and then I worked in a company similar to what was just talked about by Camilla, you know, taking a break. I worked in industry, and then I found out about material science, and then I started getting interested, and then, you know, so now I'm a material scientist, but I had no idea what that was when I did my undergrad. So be willing to be flexible and see and find out what you do enjoy, and hopefully a good strong degree will give you that flexibility. You know, you're not penned in.
Thank you. Another question we have for Clara. Your story of having to choose between science and transitioning, and how you overcame that dichotomy, is so interesting. Do you think that that is a barrier for people coming out in STEM or continuing with the program?
There's definitely a barrier. I mean, there was a report from a few years ago that showed that 1 in 3 US physicists are told to stay in the closet because it will negatively impact their careers. And so, you know, being LGBT, it shouldn't be a barrier, and it doesn't have to be a barrier. But the truth of the matter is, in some cases, it still is. And I remember there's a conference that I was at a year or so ago, and we were talking about whether we should be outing ourselves on our CVs. You know, people were saying, well, they're chair of maybe an LGBT group, but they don't necessarily write it on their CV. And, you know, at the time I said, well, I don't have that option because my papers are in different names. I mean, I don't have the option but to not out myself. And so people know something about me, even if we were to, you know, remove gender from or names from the CVs when we're applying for jobs. You're still going to be wanting to look at my papers. You're still going to see that they've got different names, which is a weird little barrier that I never really thought about. Another thing, I don't know, so Professor Christopher Jackson, who is going to be the first Black person to give a Royal Institute lecture this Christmas, believe it or not. His geology group, his master's group used to do a field work in Oman where it was dangerous and illegal to be LGBT. And so he fought as an ally to move that field work to somewhere where basically people could go, because where we hold conferences, where we do field work, that does have an impact on people. There are a lot of countries I am not safe to go, or where it's illegal for me to go. And so, you know, these things do still have an impact. And so we need to be thinking about these things, like I say, when we're organizing conferences.
We have a question for Aoife. Have you had any abject displays of sexism, especially as a professor?
I don't think I have, and if I did, they kind of washed over me, which is possibly good. As every now and again, there's things I've got to the point now where I actually say things immediately when something happens, so I don't dwell on them. And that was something I was very happy to learn how to do, because I wasn't so good at that before. But I can't think of anything. But you know, like I said earlier, by definition, I'm one of the people who didn't meet those insurmountable obstacles. You know, so I've been lucky, and I've been encouraged, and I've had the right people around me, and I've actually experienced cases where people were incredibly supportive, and I would say feminist, you know, so that they were, you know, which I describe in the simplest way of just being, you know, believing utterly in the equality of sexes. And so I've been lucky in that regard, and I can't think of anything. There's been little things that I've thought weren't great, but I don't know if they were especially because I was a woman. So it's not something that I feel I've had happen to me too much, but that could be part of how I'm, you know, it could be something that helped me get to where I am. But I mean, I've had little examples where I've had to tell people, you know, no, I'm not doing that for you. And, you know, no, I won't take the minutes again this time, because you seem to always ask me, and think little things like that. But I do just say these things now. You're muted.
Thank you. My parents came into the kitchen, so I didn't want them to like start talking and say. So for Camilla, how you met your wife sounds so cute. Please do a story time.
Okay, if you would insist. So my wife is a neuroscientist who was at the time training in this lab that did kind of neuroimaging on patients with depression. And that was what I ended up studying for my PhD. So this is a lab run by John Reuser. And my wife and I were sort of best friends for a year. We had different partners until one day we went to a conference. It has a very sexy name, the British Association of Psychopharmacology. And at this conference, we sort of realized that we had feelings for one another. And later on, a couple months after that, we ended up getting together. And then it sort of, we turned out to have, so this was now 8.5 years ago. So we turned out to have what is called the two-body problem, where all of a sudden we had to start strategizing about two careers. And one career in academia is bad enough. I wouldn't recommend two, too much. So she's a few years ahead of me. So she was wrapping up her postdoc when I was finishing my PhD, and she wanted to start a lab. And we had to sort of find somewhere that could be good for her to start a lab where I could then go and do postdoctoral training. And it was quite challenging. At first, we sort of thought maybe we would stay in London, but actually we were sort of sick of London by that point. We'd been there a while, and she had done her PhD in Cambridge, and she said, you know, I wouldn't mind going back to Cambridge. Like, are there people there that you could work with? And I was like, definitely, there are loads. So we ended up moving here, and I was a little bit reticent at first when we moved here. I thought, well, here we go, like my big city days are over. Now I live in the countryside and there are cows everywhere. And now, I mean, it took like a week, and I was like, this is it. I've got to stay here. I've got to do whatever it takes and stay here in Cambridge because I love it so much. So then we got married in Cambridge about a year and a half ago now, right before the pandemic. So great timing. Thanks. And yeah, it's been amazing to both be kind of starting our careers here. It really felt like a sort of rhythm, partially because we sort of moved here as a couple, and we sort of now have a, like, our friend and colleague network is as a couple, and that's quite nice. And because we do sort of proximal types of research, we're in different departments, but we sort of know all the same people, and that's really fun as well. And occasionally we collaborate. So over the pandemic, we had 2 papers out together because we had to be around each other all the time. The end.
That was so cute. So we have one question that's for Camilla, but really anyone can answer. Firstly, thank you to all panelists for such an inspiring and informative talk. What Dr. North said about getting into STEM because it wasn't the area that came most intuitively to her resonated with me. I was wondering if she or any of the panelists have any advice on managing your own expectations and the pressure placed upon oneself.
I'm still learning, so I don't know if I'm equipped to answer that. I suppose what I try to tell myself is, well, my line manager, who's a clinical psychologist, he has this theory about where low mood comes from, people who experience chronic low mood. And his theory is that people's discrepancies between their expectations and their perception of their own reality just becomes too big. So big that no amount of success in their reality can ever hope to close that gap. And if you're not in a low mood, really, every tiny little good thing you have can help you update your expectations about what you should achieve and what you want to achieve. And instead of kind of maintaining that gap, you can kind of learn and grow with yourself. And in the beginning, that's very challenging to do. When I first had a paper rejected, I was like absolutely gutted. I was like, well, it's probably like my career over, you know, it's probably it now. And now when I have a paper rejected, actually, it's still totally gutting. But then 24 hours later, I resubmit it, I feel fine. So you sort of find your own way of coping with your rejections and your failures and your inability to live up to yourself. And then I think you learn along the way what the real accomplishments are that you can focus on, especially in those low moments where you're feeling like you haven't achieved what you wanted to or needed to at that stage. You find the successes in your past or maybe in the future that you think might happen that you can really hone in on.
So I don't know what works for everyone, but I know for me, I do try to celebrate all the little successes when they happen and not take the things that don't work out personally, you know. So like you applied for something, you didn't get it, it's not personal. They could only give 5 of them or 10 of them or whatever the number is, and they had to just pick 10. You know, it's not because of you, it's just the way it happened. And the other thing I do that I think really helps me, it's something that Camilla mentioned earlier, is that I do some other stuff. Like I have kind of crafty hobbies. I like knitting, and I took up sewing and, you know, these kind of things. And so I make things, and at the end you've got a thing, you know, like it's a hat. Well done me, you know. And it's like, so I made a hat, and I just get that little sense of achievement and accomplishment from that. So that works for me. I know I don't do it for that reason, but I noticed that about it, you know, that I was like, you know, I really like knitting, for example. I knit probably nearly every day at this point. I'm pretty, you know, it's my unwind before I go to bed. I knit for a while watching TV or listening to a podcast or something. And I enjoy making a thing. You got a little thing at the end, and I like that. I've got a sense of accomplishment on a much shorter scale than what it takes to get a paper, for example. And so I think that helps me. So find your own version of that, maybe.
Our last question is actually related to that. It is, what kind of hobbies do you all have outside of STEM? So we've heard from Aoife. Does anyone else have any interesting hobbies they'd like to talk about?
I am a complete and utter nerd. There's no two ways about it. So I read lots of fantasy. I paint miniature figures. I spend a lot of my evenings modeling, whether I'm making dioramas. I just love I also like the fact that I've got to concentrate on it, because some of the figures I'm painting are so small that I can't be thinking about what happened in the lab. I don't have, if I do that, I'm going to mess it up. So I like hobbies where I have to concentrate. I think it's funny that my favorite sport is climbing, which is another one where you've got to concentrate because you don't want to break a leg. Doesn't happen often, but yeah, so that modeling. And also I like to again, even bigger nerd, I play Dungeons and Dragons, and I love writing the stories and creating the world. So if you've had a bad day, well, go out and kill some goblins or kill some dwarves or something. It's great.
Is it just me, or like my hobbies are more or less same like Clara's? Like I paint, I climb, and I used to do modeling when I was in my undergrad years. So that's what I do. And because of how you manage your anxiety, that kind of question, what I found is kickboxing is really helpful, like, you know, punch out your anger. And climbing is also helpful. And I find painting really soothing because like I have serious, like I shake my legs a lot. Like when I'm painting, I can't do that. So that gives me some kind of calmness. So that also helps. That's what I do.
Okay, don't worry, I don't have the same hobby, although it's very cool. I will only tell you about one hobby because it's the hobby that takes up most of my time, which is I spend about maybe like 8 or 9 hours a week doing yoga. And I do lots and lots of handstands and arm balances, and it is the best thing. And it took me years to kind of build up to doing sort of more acrobatic types of yoga. And it was just the biggest sense of accomplishment when I first felt like I could do these things that I don't know, I couldn't even really balance on one leg when I started, maybe like 11 years ago. So that's what I do.
Those are all incredibly interesting hobbies, and thank you so much for taking part in this talk. It's been incredible hearing from all of you. From what I'm hearing from our audience, they're all also find this incredibly inspiring. So thank you so much for taking part in this. And if there's nothing else anyone would like to add, I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's been amazing.
Okay, great.